The text came in at 6 in the morning, while I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me. It was from my daughter, Renee. "Dad, change of plans. You're not coming to the lake house this weekend. Patrick wants it to just be his side of the family." I read it 3 times before the words settled into something I could actually understand. The next morning, I called my bank, my accountant, and a man I hadn't spoken to in 11 years. By Sunday night, when my daughter and her husband drove back into their driveway, there was a for sale sign in the yard, and everything they owned was sitting in a dumpster at the curb. My name is Walter Doyle. I'm 68 years old, and for 36 years I ran a freight logistics company out of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of business nobody glamorizes in the movies because there's nothing glamorous about it. You build it one truck, one contract, one sleepless night at a time. I started with a single 15-year-old box truck and a loan my own father co-signed against his better judgment. And by the time I sold the company 4 years ago, I had 211 trucks on the road and a name that meant something in 3 states. I tell you that not to brag, son or daughter, whoever you are listening to me right now, but because you need to understand what kind of man I was before any of this happened, so you understand what kind of man I became after. My wife Carol passed away 3 years ago this past spring. Pancreatic cancer, the fast kind, the kind that gives you 4 months between the diagnosis and the funeral, and doesn't have the decency to let you adjust. Carol was the reason the house always smelled like something baking, the reason birthdays got remembered, the reason I came home from terrible days on the road and still felt like a human being instead of a machine that hauled freight. When she died, something in our family's center of gravity went with her. I didn't realize how much weight she'd been carrying until I was the only one left holding the rope. We had 2 children. My son, Marcus, lives out in Phoenix, works in software, calls me on Sundays out of something that feels more like obligation than affection. And I've made my peace with that, because at least he's honest about it. And then there's Renee, my daughter, 31 years old, married 4 years now to a man named Patrick Webb. I want to be fair to Patrick, or at least I wanted to be, for a long time. He's good-looking in that way that photographs well, works in commercial real estate, talks about portfolios and verticals at family dinners like the rest of us are supposed to be impressed. When Renee brought him home the first time, I shook his hand and felt absolutely nothing. No warmth, no red on the man at all, like shaking hands with a closed door. Carol felt it too. She never said a bad word about him, not once, but I caught her watching him sometimes with an expression I'd only ever seen her wear at the DMV. After Carol died, I did what a lot of grieving fathers do. I tried to buy back the family I was afraid of losing. I paid for Renee and Patrick's wedding outright, $110,000, because Renee wanted the wedding Carol would have wanted for her, and I couldn't say no to that. I co-signed the loan on their house in the Worthington Hills neighborhood, a 4-bedroom place with a stone facade and a circular driveway that probably should have told me something about what I was walking into. I set up a trust for Renee when she turned 30, $240,000 meant to be a cushion, an emergency fund, something to make sure my daughter never had to feel the kind of fear Carol and I felt in our 20s, when the freight business almost folded twice in 18 months. Patrick knew about every dollar of it. I made sure of that, because I'm not a man who hides his intentions. I told them both, plainly, at Carol's grave on the 1-year anniversary of her death, that everything I had left was theirs eventually, that the only thing I asked in return was that they let me stay close, that they didn't let me become a man who eats Thanksgiving dinner alone in a house built for 4 people. Renee cried and hugged me. Patrick shook my hand and said, "You're the best, Walter. You really are." I believed him. God help me. I believed him completely. The lake house weekend wasn't even Renee and Patrick's idea originally. It was mine. Every August for 19 years, Carol and I had rented the same cabin on Lake Erie's southern shore, a place called Hartfield Landing. And every year the whole family came, my kids, my grandkids when they came along, even cousins from out of state some years. After Carol died, I kept the tradition alive because it was one of the only threads still connecting us to who we used to be as a family. This year I'd paid for the whole week up front, $11,000 for the largest cabin on the property, the one with the dock and the screened porch where Carol used to sit with her coffee every single morning of every single trip. I had been looking forward to that week for months. I'd already bought new fishing gear for my grandson, Renee and Patrick's 6-year-old boy, Caleb. I'd written out, in an actual notebook, The things I wanted to tell my grandson about his grandmother. Stories I was afraid would die with me if I didn't say them out loud to somebody small enough to still believe in magic. And then, at 6 in the morning on the Tuesday before we were supposed to leave, that text came through. Dad, change of plans. You're not coming to the lake house this weekend. Patrick wants it to just be his side of the family. I sat there at my kitchen table for what must have been 20 minutes, just staring at the screen, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. I had paid for the cabin. I owned the truck we were supposed to drive up in. My late wife's coffee mug was still sitting in that cabin's cupboard, because the property owner let me leave a few things there year-round since we'd been renting it so long. And somehow, in the span of one text message, I had become a man who was no longer welcome at his own tradition, uninvited from a trip that existed only because I had built it, sustained it, and paid for it every single year since before Patrick Webb ever knew my daughter's name. I want you to understand something about men like me. Whoever's listening to this, we don't yell. We don't smash things. Carol used to say I had the quietest temper in Franklin County, and she meant it as both a compliment and a warning. When I get hurt badly enough, something in me goes still and cold, like a lake freezing over from the bottom up, where you can't see it happening until you're already standing on solid ice that wasn't there the day before. I didn't text back right away. I made another pot of coffee. I sat in Carol's chair, the one across from mine, and I let myself feel exactly how much that message hurt, because I've learned that grief and rage need to be felt honestly before they can be turned into something useful. Then I picked up the phone and called a man named Greg Esposito. Greg had been my attorney for 22 years, ever since the early days of the freight company when I needed someone sharp enough to keep me out of trouble with 3 different state transportation boards at once. Greg picked up on the second ring, the way he always did when it was actually important, and I told him everything. The text, the wedding I'd paid for, the trust, the co-signed mortgage, the lake house tradition that I had just been surgically removed from like a tumor nobody wanted to look at anymore. Greg was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I'll never forget. Walter, you've spent 4 years letting that boy treat your generosity like it was owed to him. You sure you're ready for what it looks like to take it back? I told him I was ready. I had never meant anything more in my life. Here's where I need to back up and give you some context, because what happened next only makes sense if you understand the architecture of what I'd built. The house in Worthington Hills, the one with the circular driveway, was never actually in Renee and Patrick's names alone. When I co-signed that mortgage 3 years ago, my attorney insisted, over my objections at the time, that we structure it as a co-ownership arrangement through a small holding company I controlled, something called Doyle Family Holdings, LLC, originally set up decades earlier to manage real estate assets for the freight business. I'd forgotten about most of the details, honestly. I trusted Greg, signed where he told me to sign, and went on with my life. Renee and Patrick believed, as far as I knew, that the house was simply theirs, financed conventionally, with my name attached only as a guarantor who'd eventually be removed once their income qualified them independently. They were wrong. I owned 49% of that house, and under the LLC's operating agreement, any sale or major transaction required my signature. The trust was a different matter, simpler and more brutal in its clarity. $240,000, structured as a revocable trust, meaning I retained full legal authority to dissolve it and redirect the funds at any time before Renee turned 35. She was 31. And the freight company, even though I'd sold the trucks and the routes 4 years ago, I had retained ownership of 3 commercial properties the business used to operate out of, including one large warehouse in the Short North District that I had, 6 months earlier, quietly begun leasing to a logistics startup for considerably more than I'd ever made running freight myself. That warehouse generated more passive income now than the entire trucking company had in its best year. None of my children knew that. I'd never mentioned it because there had never been a reason to. I called Greg back that same afternoon and told him I wanted to use all 3 instruments, the house, the trust, and the warehouse income, not to punish my daughter cruelly, but to make absolutely certain that nobody in that family ever again mistook my love for weakness. Slow down, Greg said. Tell me what you actually want the outcome to be. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I want them to come home from that lake house this weekend, I said, and understand, completely, without question, exactly what they threw away. Greg laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. that I can do. The next 2 days moved fast, faster than anything in my life had moved since the week we buried Carol. Greg filed the paperwork to dissolve the trust on Wednesday morning. $240,000 redirected into a new account, one that I controlled entirely, in the name of a scholarship fund I would set up later in Carol's memory for kids from logistics and trucking families who couldn't otherwise afford college. It felt right, putting Carol's name on something that would outlast all of this ugliness. Wednesday afternoon, Greg and I exercised my rights under the Doyle Family Holdings operating agreement. Because I held 49% ownership and the agreement required unanimous consent for any refinancing, but only majority consent for an outright sale to a third party at fair market value, Greg found a buyer within hours, a real estate investment group he'd worked with before, willing to close fast on a 4-bedroom home in a desirable Columbus suburb at full market price. Patrick had never read the operating agreement closely enough to understand that my 49%, combined with a sale clause Greg had built in years earlier specifically as a protective measure, gave me the power to force a sale even over his objection. As long as I gave both parties their proportional share of the proceeds, I wasn't stealing from my daughter. I was simply, finally, exercising control over an asset I had always technically controlled. The sale closed Thursday. Renee and Patrick left for the lake house Friday morning with no idea that the house they were driving away from no longer belonged to them. Friday afternoon, I drove out to Worthington Hills myself. I want to tell you honestly, this was the hardest part. Standing in my daughter's driveway, watching a crew of 6 men I'd hired through a property liquidation service Greg recommended, men who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, estate clearouts, foreclosures, divorces gone ugly. Watching them carry Renee's furniture out to the curb felt like something was being surgically removed from my own chest. But I had made one decision that mattered more to me than anything else in this entire plan. And it's the part I want you to hear most clearly. Whoever you are listening to this story, I did not throw any of it away. Everything that came out of that house, the furniture, Renee's clothes, Caleb's toys, the photographs, every single item was carefully boxed, labeled, and loaded onto a moving truck bound for a storage facility I'd rented under my own name. The only things that went into the dumpster sitting visibly at the curb, the thing I wanted Renee and Patrick to see the moment they pulled into that driveway, were Patrick's belongings specifically. His golf clubs, his home office furniture, a leather chair he'd bragged about at Thanksgiving that cost more than my first truck. I let the crew destroy those, visibly, deliberately, because I wanted one unmistakable image waiting for him when he came home. An image with a message attached to it that needed no further explanation. Caleb's bedroom, I had the crew handle differently. Every toy, every piece of furniture, packed gently into clearly marked boxes, moved to my own house, into the guest bedroom I'd already begun converting into a room for my grandson, because no matter what his father had done, that little boy was never going to come home from a family vacation to find his entire world treated like garbage. That wasn't justice. That was just cruelty wearing justice's clothes, and I refused to become a man Carol wouldn't have recognized. By Friday evening, the house stood empty, the new owner's moving crew already scheduled to start their own renovation the following Monday. A bright red sold sign stood in the yard where, 24 hours earlier, my daughter's family had believed they would live for the next 30 years. I drove home that night and sat in Carol's chair again, and for the first time since that 6 a.m. text message, I let myself cry. Saturday, I did something I debated for 2 full days, something Greg advised against and something I did anyway. I drove out to Hartfield Landing myself. I didn't go to the cabin. I didn't want a confrontation in front of my grandson, in front of Patrick's family, in front of strangers who had no part in any of this. I parked at the small marina down the road, the one I'd taken Renee fishing from when she was 9 years old, and I called my daughter. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright with lake weekend cheerfulness, completely unaware. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "I need you to listen to me carefully, Renee," I said, "and I need you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you, I did because I love you, even though I know it won't feel that way for a long time." I told her about the trust. I told her about the house. I told her, as gently as I could manage, about the warehouse income she'd never known existed, the financial cushion that had quietly been there her entire adult life, the cushion that Patrick had just spent 4 years treating as a foregone inheritance, rather than a gift that required, at minimum, basic human decency in return. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. "You sold our house," she finally said, her voice flat, disbelieving. "I sold a house I owned 49% of, because the man you married decided 4 years of my money and my love bought him the right to uninvite me from my own wife's tradition with a text message at 6 in the morning. Dad, that's not what this was about. Patrick just wanted." "I know exactly what Patrick wanted," I said. "He wanted everything I built, with none of the relationship that's supposed to come attached to it. He wanted me gone, but my money still flowing." I gave him a clearer version of gone than he was expecting. Renee was crying now, and some small, aching part of me wanted to take it all back, to drive to that cabin and fix it, the way fathers are supposed to fix things for their daughters. But I made myself say the rest, because Carol would have made me say it, and because Renee needed to hear it from me directly, not filtered through Patrick's version later. "Everything you owned is safe, Renee. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every toy of Caleb's. It's in storage, paid for, untouched, waiting for you. None of it was ever about hurting you or my grandson. It was about making sure Patrick finally understood that my generosity was never a foundation he got to build a life on top of without me in it." "What happens now?" she asked. And for the first time, she sounded less like an angry wife defending her husband and more like the 9-year-old girl I used to take fishing off this exact dock. "That depends entirely on what kind of marriage you want to have," I said. "And what kind of man Patrick decides to be once the lake house weekend is over, and he understands the consequences of treating an old man's love like an obligation instead of a gift." I drove home Saturday night without seeing my daughter face to face, because some conversations need distance before they can become honest. Sunday evening, around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Renee, her voice raw, exhausted, and I could hear in the background the specific kind of silence that exists in a car after a fight that's already burned itself out. "We're standing in the driveway," she said. "There's nothing here. Patrick's losing his mind." "Put him on," I said. There was rustling, and then Patrick's voice came through, tight and furious in a way I'd never heard from him before. The smooth real estate confidence completely stripped away. "Walter, what the hell did you do? This is insane. You can't just—" "I can," I said, my voice calm, the calmest I'd been in days. "And I did. You spent 4 years acting like my money was your birthright, and my presence in this family was optional. I corrected the math. We have nowhere to live, Walter. We have a 6-year-old. Caleb's belongings are safe in my guest room, where he'll be staying until you and my daughter figure out what kind of life you actually want to build, together or otherwise. Your golf clubs, on the other hand, are currently in a landfill in Licking County, which feels, if I'm honest, like the most accurate metaphor I've produced in my entire life." Patrick didn't have a response to that. For the first time since I'd met him, the man had absolutely nothing smooth to say. "Here's what happens next," I continued. "You and Renee are welcome at my house tonight. For as long as you need, no conditions attached except one. You will never again make a decision about this family that erases me from it. Not at a lake house, not at a holiday table, not anywhere. I buried my wife 3 years ago, Patrick. I am not interested in being slowly buried by my own family while I'm still breathing." I heard Renee take the phone back. "Dad," she said quietly, "I didn't know about the lake house. Patrick sent that text without telling me. I found out the same morning you did." I sat with that for a long moment, because it changed something. Not everything, but something important. "Then you and I have a different conversation to have," I said. "But it starts with you coming home tonight, and it starts with the truth, all of it, on the table. No more surprises hiding behind smooth talk and real estate vocabulary." They came to my house that night. Caleb ran straight into the guest bedroom and found his toys waiting for him exactly where he'd left them, just in a different house, and the relief on that little boy's face was worth every sleepless hour of the previous 4 days. Patrick and Renee slept in my old guest room, the one Carol used to keep made up for visitors, and in the morning, over coffee at the same kitchen table where this entire reckoning began, Patrick looked at me with something that might have been the first honest expression I'd ever seen on his face. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "You don't fix it," I told him. "You earn it back, slowly, the same way I earned everything I ever gave you. One honest day at a time." It's been 4 months now since that Tuesday morning text message. Renee and Patrick are renting a smaller place across town, paying their own way. No co-signed mortgage, no trust fund cushion, just the two of them and Caleb figuring out, for the first time in their marriage, what it actually costs to build a life instead of inheriting one. Patrick calls me now, actually calls, not just texts, and I won't pretend the relationship is fully repaired because some things take longer than 4 months to rebuild. But last week, he asked if he could take me to dinner, just the two of us. No Renee, no Caleb, just a father-in-law and a son-in-law finally talking honestly for the first time in 4 years. He thanked me, and I don't think he meant for the house or the money he no longer had. I think he meant for finally treating him like a man who needed to earn his place instead of a man who could simply assume it. The scholarship fund in Carol's name made its first award last month, full tuition for a kid from a trucking family in rural Ohio, who reminded me, more than I expected, of myself at 19 years old, hungry and unproven, and certain that hard work was the only inheritance that actually mattered. And every August, I still drive up to Hartfield Landing. This year, Renee, Patrick, and Caleb came with me, and we stayed in the same cabin, the one with the dock and the screened porch where Carol used to drink her coffee every single morning for 19 years straight. Caleb caught his first fish off that dock, a small bluegill that he insisted on naming, and for just a moment, watching my grandson hold that fish up with both hands and shout for everyone at the lake to see, I felt Carol standing right there beside me on that porch, the way she always had, reminding me that love built carefully enough can survive almost anything, even the people we love trying, for one terrible week, to leave it behind. Love isn't measured by how much we give, but by how clearly we ask to still be seen. Walter didn't destroy his family to win, he drew a line so they could finally meet him honestly, without money standing between them. Real strength sometimes looks quiet. A closed account, a kept promise, a grandson's toys waiting safely in a guest room. Even the coldest winter thaws when someone finally tells the truth. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a warm, positive life lesson along the way.